And just in preface, people ask, as a Chabad rabbi, you hear all the time from people, oh, I'm a bad Jew or something like that. And my response after learning this has been really to quote this, to tell them that in Judaism, you're not evaluated. First of all, you're not evaluating yourself in the same kind of way. It's not a no sum. It's not a zero sum kind of game. It's far larger than that. When I tell them about this concept of a ramp versus steps, it's a very, very crucial idea, and it's a very powerful idea that the Rebbe is going to present over here, that when we begin our process of serving God, which happens every single day, we have to look at it from the perspective of a ramp instead of from the perspective of steps. And so that's why chapter 4 is going to be raising the ramp, stepping out the steps. Two different ways of serving God, and we need to look at ourselves as being on a ramp as opposed to being on steps. So what we said so far is that there is this bittul that begins the process, that kind of propels us into a state of self-assessment, and that self-assessment brings us to the next level, which is once again bittul, which is once again nullification. The first nullification is the simplicity of a soldier or a servant doing what they're supposed to be told. The later stage is one of complete and absolute self-nullification, where the person no longer has a sense of ego at all, because they've really, really eradicated it completely to the point where they are totally and absolutely devoted. There's no distracting sense of self whatsoever. So he said that concept is also applicable in our daily service. And we're going to see how that works right now. So on the first stage of the journey, this is chapter 4, we apply the verse, do not ascend to my altar via steps, so that your nakedness shall not appear upon it. Lo talev b'malot al mizbechi asher lo tigale ervatcha alav. There's a verse that's stated right after the Aseret Dibrot, right after the Ten Commandments. The Jewish people received the Ten Commandments, and then immediately afterwards there's several commands. One of them is, if you're going to make a mizbeach for me, I want it to be made out of stone. I want it made out of earth. I do not want it made by steel or metal. And then it goes and says, okay, you're going to do it, no steps. So the simple explanation, the basic explanation is that even though the Kohanim wore pants in their, as part of their priestly garments, but when stepping up steps, there's a possibility of seeing the male form, and as a result of that, there's an element of immodesty. That's a simple explanation. But that certainly can be brought to a much deeper level, especially considering the fact that this is a command coming directly after the Ten Commandments. All right, this has been this incredible revelation, and suddenly God says, all right, and by the way, we need to start talking a couple practical things. I don't like steps. So here's where the Rebbe really brings this concept and teaches us a whole different layer of things. And he says what this means is when one wishes to begin his ascent to the divine, he does so imitating the process of ascending the altar, not by using steps, but by using a ramp. The difference between the two is each individual step represents its own level. And as one goes upwards, they need to pause at each level, settle into it, and then go further to the next step. But a ramp is made up of one smooth surface. A slope is such that it is easy to walk gently upward. So let's compare the two with regards to, he's going to explain it a little bit further soon, but I want to talk about this for a second. A step is a flat surface, and then afterwards, a movement upwards. And when one is standing on one step, they are by definition not stepping on the next step. They are making a statement, I am here, I am not there. And that's really, really, really important. Because as soon as a person starts defining themselves, no matter what the definition is, you are making a definition that you are not something else. And when it comes to serving the divine, beginning this process of the service, focusing on what you are not, even by just making a statement of what I am, is already negating something. And that's where the Torah uses the term, Asher lo tigaleh ervatcha alav, that I do not want your nakedness to be revealed upon it. Listen, God says, I know you have flaws. I made you, but there's no reason for you to be revealing your flaws. There's no reason for you to be making a statement about your flaws by stating where you are and where you are not. Contrast that with a ramp. A ramp is one movement upwards. It is one slope. And when one person is on any particular level of the ramp, they are automatically connected with anywhere else on the ramp. There's no differentiation going on. And if a person makes a microscopic movement upwards, they've moved closer to the top. And if they take a gigantic leap forward, well, they're just closer to the top. No matter what the size, so to speak, of the movement, it doesn't really make a difference, because the fact of the matter is there's movement. You're more connected to the top. Now consider the fact that this ramp to the divine is infinite, so that actually makes everybody on an infinite plane. And now no longer you need to focus on any differentiation, because if you're taking a bird's eye view of an infinite plane, well, everybody's basically in the same space. So there's so many different elements of how we can see the beauty of this concept of a ramp, but just like take one concept, without even, I guess we'll take two ideas before going further in the text. One idea is this idea that we said before. When somebody tells me I'm not a good Jew, what they're doing is they're defining themselves based on some kind of predisposed picture of what they consider to be a good Jew or whatever it is, and they're saying, I am not that. But when you tell them, listen, we're all on a ramp, and we're all on an infinite ramp, it's all about your connection to the top and the fact that you're trying to move, then they look at themselves and say, you know what, I'm not far away from that. That's something that I can relate to. Well, that's something that I understand. I'm also trying to move upwards, but my movement upwards may be in a small detail, and somebody else's movement might be in a bigger detail. But that doesn't really make a difference in the vastness of the whole picture. Ben, you're muted. Okay. So that's one perspective on it. The other perspective is simply, for example, when you're talking about davening with a minyan. You might go to a prison, and you are Jew number 10, and you're surrounded by 9 prisoners. And this guy is a murderer. This guy is, a thief. This guy is a tax cheat. Whatever. You go through every single one of them and say, okay, how am I supposed to daven with these guys? When you take the perspective of the ramp, it eliminates any of those problems. Asher lo tigale ervatcha alav. The point over here is not to reveal your flaws. And when everybody's on the ramp, then we're all just trying to connect to God. It doesn't make a difference where we are and where we're not. But on steps, I'm up here, you're down there, and how can I possibly connect with you? That's a problem. And that's the reason why God says, I don't want steps. It has to be on a ramp. And the Rebbe continues and says, the concepts of steps and a ramp are equivalent in their divine analogs to Memale and Sovev. Memale, as we know, reflects its energy into different worlds and dimensions based on their particulars, details. Memale, like we explained, it fills the world. It is the immanent energy. Immanent. Sovev, on the other hand, exists above as it does below. It is the great transcendent. It's transcendent in such a way that it equalizes everything. We've described it before as the great equalizer, that all the differentiation doesn't exist because of its magnitude. In prayer, one elicits mamale as they travel upwards from one prayer to another, climbing the rungs. Tefillah is considered, as we've discussed before, as sulam mutzav arza magia shamayma, or ladder that is standing firmly on the ground and it reaches up to the heaven. That's the description that of the Jacob's ladder. And the Zohar explains that that's the idea of prayer. You're climbing the rungs. Now, if you're climbing the rungs, that means there's this process of going from one level to the next, and that there are these madrigot, there are steps. So what's the difference between the two? Well, there's the first stage is not going to steps. The first stage is Sovev. The first stage is the total and absolute equalization of the entire process. And the Rebbe says, but Sovev is elicited as one begins their spiritual state or circumstance in the manner of a ramp, upward movement, minus the limitations of orderly steps. The Rebbe continues and says, the verse therefore states, do not ascend to my altar via steps. When beginning the process of sacrificing the animal soul and elevating it to its source, this needs to be done not through steps. There's a distinct deficiency that exists in the service of steps. As soon as you start thinking about the particular step, the individual spiritual that you stand upon, then your nakedness will appear upon it. You will see your own flaws. You will see that you are incapable of true love and fear of God. And as a result of this negative self-perception, you will then avoid serving God properly. So what we've described before is really a problem to anybody, no matter where they are, whether a person thinks they're a good Jew or a bad Jew, because no matter a person's particular level, as soon as you start kind of assessing yourself in this kind of way, a person says, who am I? What am I? And how can I possibly serve God with true love and fear, this total and absolute devotion or anything of the sort? And so therefore, that negative self-perception is going to immediately distract you from serving God. I can't do it. The other side of things, of course, he doesn't mention this here. The other side of things is that if a person thinks that they are great and they are capable of love and fear of God, then that's ego. So no matter what the step that you're going to define yourself on, whether it's going to be a positive self-perception, which is probably incorrect anyway, or a negative self-perception, which is going to be self-destructive, don't start your service of God with assessment. That's not what goes on. And what needs to go on is this idea of a ramp, that I am connected with the top, and it's an easy, slow movement, and that every single step that I make is a positive step, even if it's a tiny step in the connection to the divine. And that's what the Rebbe insinuates over here. But at the end of the day, no matter one's spiritual state, one is obligated to fulfill Torah and Mitzvot, at the very least within their thought, speech, and deed. And therefore, do not ascend via steps. Ignore your exact spiritual state for the meantime. was something else that just popped in my head and disappeared for the second. Negative self-perception. Oh, whatever, it's gone. So no steps. Rather, the Rebbe continues, one must ascend specifically via a ramp. The Mishnah states that when going up the altar, the priest would go up on the ramp, alav kevesh, and turn towards the rampart, ufana lasoviv. And here the Rebbe gives a brilliant explanation of this Mishnaic term, which is actually something that we use in prayer. We say this in prayer every single day in Karbanot, right before Hodul Hashem Kir V'Shmo. We talk about Eizom Makom Shazvachim, where were the placement of the sacrifices, and then among other things, we mentioned this little statement about the Kohen. The Kohen would go up on the ramp, Allah v'kevesh ufana l'sovev, and then he would turn around the ramp was a rampart, so to speak, a little kind of edge, a ledge, and he would turn around, he would go around that. That's the Mishnah that we quote. So there says in spiritual terms, what this means is that when one wants to ascend, Allah, when you want to go up, what do? He must subjugate himself. Kovesh means to conquer. Kevesh means a ramp, but it also comes from the word kovesh, lichbosh, to conquer. He must conquer his own thoughts in the manner of itkafia, in the manner of subduing his own thoughts and desires and will and anything that's going on, without considering his particular level. How does he do that? He does that, he must put aside himself completely by turning towards upana and investing himself completely within the perspective of sovev. Upana lesovev, turn towards sovev. When you invest yourself in the perspective of sovev, this is, like we say, which is totally above measurement of any kind. So there's no small, there's no big, because when you're taking the infinite perspective, it all is. And there's a fascinating idea to remember. He doesn't say this clearly here, but from the perspective of Sovev, who am I to pray? I'm nothing. This is the vastness of all of creation, which Atzilut, the entire dimension of Atzilut, in which everything is totally and absolutely unified with godliness, and the physical, nothingness of this world, they're all absolutely equal. So who the heck am I? How am I supposed to pray with such a perspective? The answer is that God chose me. I am not praying because I am something. I am praying because God wants me to pray. I'm not doing it just because of, I need to ask God for certain things, I need to thank God for certain things, or anything like that. I am connecting because God chose me. And so therefore we're taking the perspective of God. God, you want me in your room. And that eliminates any of this negative self-perception. It eliminates the ego involved. And it eliminates all of those things. And what it does, actually, especially at the beginning of prayer, it eliminates any of the baggage that we have coming into prayer. We come into prayer, we're struggling with one thing or the other. We're exhausted. We didn't sleep well. We have some kind of either family issues, or we have financial issues, or we have health issues, or all of the above, or whatever it is. And, so considering all those things, I'm not there. But when you take the Soviet perspective, it eliminates everything. There are no details to consider. This first level of bittul, this first level of itkafia, is one in which there's total and absolute focus on the goal. The goal is the connection with God, that God chose me to be connected. And the Rebbe says afterwards, and because he began his service in this manner, he will truly be able to reach the higher levels inferred by the continuation of the Mishnah. He will come to the southeastern corner, and then afterwards, each corner, as it enumerates in the Mishnah, and each one of those corners represents different spiritual levels. You'll be able to climb the rungs of the ladder. You'll be able to go up those spiritual states, but only once you've begun in the process in which a person lets go of their own personal stuff. Get on the ramp. Don't define yourself by steps, and don't define yourself at all. Just get on the ramp of connection with the divine. This idea of the ramp is absolutely, there's so much richness in this concept. You can really keep going and going and going on it. But it's, when on a purely personal level, this is one of these ideas that I live off of. It's one of these ideas that I kind of go back to when I'm trying to re-energize myself or get myself back into a certain space that I want to get to. Allah v'kevesh, throw out all those extra thoughts, subdue those issues, the frustrations, the feelings, the negative self-perception. Those things are completely irrelevant here. How do I do that? I turn towards Sovev, focus on Sovev as God is transcendent and chooses me in my state, and without paying attention to any of those details. That's how it's done. And so Rebbe continues and says, we find a similar concept expressed in the verse in Tehillim. Lamnatseach al Yonat Elem Mizmor David. So the choir master regarding, Lamnatseach Yonat Elem Rechokim. To the choir master regarding the distant dove of silence. So he says the dove refers to the totality of the Jewish people as they are both in their source as well as below within the world. They are referred to as the dove of silence, denoting their connection with the silence of Keter, which we discussed before. The idea of Keter being connected with silence, this higher level prior to revelation, which we said is an extremely transcendent level. And that's why they're called Yonat Elem. Question is, what does that have to do with Rechokim? What do those who are distant have anything to do with such a lofty level? So Rebbe, basically, you can take it two different ways. But we'll see. He says Rechokim could either mean, one or the other. It could be a self-perception in a negative way or a positive way. Here he describes it in a positive way. Rather, consider that Tanya states, the closer to God one is, the more one considers themselves to be nothing. The more there's greater and greater humility the closer one gets to godliness, because of the fact that they recognize their own insignificance. So the more one grasps and understands godliness, the more one recognizes his own distance from godliness. But still, despite this recognition, it does not prevent him from serving as he should. And this is the silent dove when he serves with self-nullification. The silence here is bittul. He puts his own feelings aside. Even as he senses his own lowliness, he does not reckon it with the individual step he stands upon, but he simply serves. So we're saying here, Rechokim couldn't mean either thing. It could mean the greatest of the great who are so humble that they feel that they are distant from God. Or it could be somebody that actually is distant from God. But either side, no matter who such a person is, he recognizes that what I need to do, where my personal state is, where I feel my state is completely irrelevant. He silences those thoughts and he puts those thoughts completely behind himself because he says, I have a job to do and that is to connect. So it's only through this process of self-subjugation and its kafia that one can eventually attain total self-nullification that rests with the intensity of Soviet. So you begin with this process and you move upwards. You move upwards in the process that happens to go through this intellectual process. But the first stage of the process is through the self-nullification. And just to talk about this idea of feeling distance when you're close, it's a very, very important concept. In a purely physical form, anybody who's gone mountain climbing understands that, you see the mountain as it is from a distance, and it looks like, okay, this is one elevation upwards. The more you get involved with the mountain, the more you realize how vast it is, and how dangerous it is, and how difficult the climb is. From a distance, it looks like, it's still, you just go right up. This is a story that kind of reveals my own stupidity, but that's okay. When growing up in Pittsburgh, you're surrounded by the Allegheny Mountains, and the Allegheny Mountains are very soft.
Hi.
Good morning, Robert.
I am well. It's okay. I'm in the middle of my my Chabad Friday morning, but I'm doing both, so that's good. So Baruch Hashem, everything is good with me, and hopefully things are good with you.
There we go. So they're very eroded mountains, and they're pretty, shall we say, tame. We moved out to Seattle, and my wife and I were not even married for a year, and we really knew nothing about the area, but we were quite shocked to see Mount Rainier in the distance. And we were told Mount Rainier is 90 miles away. Mount Rainier is 14,400 feet. We did not know that at the time. I figured 90 miles away, that's pretty cool. So we decided one Pesach, the first day of Chol HaMoed, that we were first in Seattle, we decided to drive out to Mount Rainier, we'll go check it out. And I was thinking that it was something like Mount Washington outside of Pittsburgh, which is, I don't even know how tall it is, but it's not very tall. It's probably something simple, like 1,200 feet or something like that. Maybe a little bit higher. You can drive up to a lookout or something like that. You can check it out. So it's a beautiful spring day in Seattle. But when we started driving towards Mount Rainier National Park, we were shocked by snow. And we didn't even get you couldn't drive up anywhere on the mountain, anywhere close to the mountain. Later we found out where we had driven to. There's a hotel that is basically just on the edge of the park, and that was where we had driven to, which is probably not at any particular elevation beyond I don't know, I don't even know what the elevation at that point is, but it's certainly not, shall we say, up on the mountain or anything of the sort. But we had no idea the vastness of the mountain, just not the slightest clue. You're just looking at it from the distance. You're like, oh, that's really cool. I'm sure that's really beautiful up on top. You don't think about the fact that people practice to climb Mount Everest on Mount Rainier. So the distance gives you a perception that is very, very delusional. The closer you get, the greater appreciation for the vastness, for the magnitude, for the greatness. And that gives you more and more humility, because the closer you seem to get, the less you can say, okay, I've got it now. And so that's a very, very important idea in godliness. When a person feels more self, a person is more intoxicated with themselves, they're more distant. And I'll end with one final word. There's a pasuk in Tehillim, Im esak shamayim sham ata, v'atzia sheol hineka. And the Chassidim would say about this verse, if I climb up to heavens, Shamata, you are there, God is distant. But Vatzia Sheho, if I find myself present in the pit, through humility, Hineka, here you are. Godliness is close. So humility gives us that ability to be able to connect because we recognize it, that we are so distant, so to speak. And this process. Part of that process is not humility by putting ourselves down, but by recognizing that we're on this infinite ramp and taking the perspective of Sovev, that God chose us, and it's the vastness of it all that allows us the capability to be able to serve God no matter where we are. So I find that incredibly powerful, and I wish you all the ability to be able to take that and apply it to yourselves and your families and your friends. And for that, I wish you a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos, and God willing, we'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos.
Shabbos,
Thank
good
you,
Shabbos.
Rabbi. Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Okay, we're going to learn Gemara Brachas now, Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph.